Hi, everyone. Thank you again for tuning into the Policing in America podcast. I'm your host, Sergeant Tom, and I have with me Jessica Nordell as our guest today. Jessica Nordell is an award-winning author. She's a science writer and speaker known for blending rigorous science and compassionate humanity. Her first book, The End of Bias, A Beginning, was shortlisted for the 2022 Columbia Journalism Lucas Prize for Excellence in Nonfiction, the 2022 NYPL Bernstein Book Award for Excellence in Journalism, and the 2021 Royal Society Science Book Prize. And not only that, but you also have Adam Grant, who gives you a nice little shout out, which is what I think every author would like to have when they write their first book, is to have Adam Grant talk about it. So Jessica, thank you so much. Congratulations on this masterpiece. And thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Okay, so I'm going to jump right in, and more about you and your work and your bio will come out during this. But the first thing, the title of the podcast is going to have something to do with bias, and I'm going to see cops roll their eyes. I'm going to see cops say, again, I'm not racist. I'm over this. So as we launch into this, maybe you can set the stage for why you think this is important and why it's just not another wash, rinse, repeat cycle on bias. However you'd like to introduce this topic in your own words.
You know, first of all, I want to say I spent a lot of time with police officers when I was researching this book. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for the job, for the challenges of the job, for the incredible difficulty of what, cops do every day, whether it's showing up to a domestic violence situation or telling parents they've lost their child in a car accident. I mean, I can only imagine in some, in many cases, the kind of challenges of the job. And so, my perspective is the question that I was really trying to ask with the portion of the book about policing in America is there a way to repair the relationship between police and the communities they serve? The last few years have highlighted so many things. And, if anything, just how much distrust there is between these communities and how that ultimately impacts safety for everyone. We need our officers and our community members to have trusting, respectful relationships, because that is the foundation of being able to have basic public safety. And so, the reason that I think officers who, may be rolling their eyes, may be like, oh, I've heard, about implicit bias, I've gone through the trainings, whatever. I think the reason that thinking about these issues and connecting them to officer safety as well, officer well-being, public safety is really critical. Actually, sorry, let me take that again.
Sure.
I totally understand and spoke with a lot of officers who sort of rolled their eyes at the idea of implicit bias and these issues. And I think what we have to understand is that, this is about officer wellness as well. This is about tackling the kind of chronic stresses that can lead officers to biased behavior. And those chronic stresses also impact officer well-being. So I really think that by addressing these issues in a deep and meaningful way, it really will benefit everyone.
I agree with you. There are so many neat things you talked about. And I've chewed through the book. So I think because I try to get through it so fast, I have to definitely reread it again. There was an individual you talked about early on in the book. She was a researcher, Divine.
Trish Devine. That's
Trish
right.
Devine, who's also it sounded like a suite mate with Banaji.
Correct.
Right. So there's discussion on IAT and all that. So what I liked with, and I highlighted here, Devine's office mate, Mahazarin Banaji, told Devine that she had revealed the dark side of the mind when we talk about bias. And this is what tends to happen. Bias has this connotation with negativity and just like bad behavior, just purely bad behavior. We'll keep it there. But what does Devine say is that having bias associations didn't mean you were a bad person. It meant you existed in a culture. And I thought I wrote on their Bravo Divine, like, it's very neat for someone to say, look, this isn't a bad thing. You're not a bad person. You're in this environment, and this environment has lended itself to allow you to see things a certain way. And, hopefully you and I will get into a little bit about the neuroscience, the heuristics, and how we chunk our information, how that all gets grouped in our brain. And so how easy it is to make these associations. How are you trying to change the word bias to make it palatable, to just even get your foot in the door? Because I talk about it. I still deliver the training on this. And I have yet to figure out a way to say, and even a word, even a synonym with it. I'm going to say, look, we're going to talk about this. And it's important, but it might be important for reasons you don't really understand because you've been told this. Every time we talk about bias, it's like, well, you could see the cop's implicit bias, or you could see their bias. So it's always made. I'm going to let you kind of chew on that a little bit. What do you think?
Yeah, the way that I think about it is we all live in this culture, and we have inherited ideas that are hundreds of years old, in some cases thousands of years old, and we have been absorbing them since we were babies. Whether it's ideas about men and women, or ideas about racial groups or racial hierarchies. These are really old ideas. We didn't invent them, but we have inherited them, and we can see that they're still living in our minds in all sorts of different ways. I mean, there are so many research studies that I cite in the book, not only about police, but about teachers and doctors and nurses and, professors, in all walks of life. You see this tendency of people to treat others differently depending on what social group they belong to. And that's when I think about it, because I see it in myself too, it's like an inheritance that we have to grapple with, rather than a character flaw or an individual flaw. This is a cultural situation that we're living in.
It's really, you have a nice way with your words. It's an inheritance that we're grappling with. I want to know if you were the one that said this, or with this Divine, because I'm going to use this, and I'm going to cite the people properly. A belief is like a newsletter you intentionally subscribe to. So I want to be a good person, and I want to police, and I want to protect the community. An association, though, your bias, these associations with what you're doing, is like spam from a company that obtained your address. You don't choose the spam. You didn't want it there, but here it is clogging your inbox, and you can't get off the mailing list. That's
me.
You? That might be the most brilliant contemporary analogy. So I want to make sure when I talk about it, I use you. But that, I think, is what if we can push past it and stop making bias this nefarious, evil, intentional act. Right. And look, this is an association. And how do we separate fault from this? You see an officer make any number of mistakes, and we say, well, that's their bias coming in. And then it's almost like punitive, as opposed to what you're saying is, look, they're trying to do the right thing, but this spam is there. Thoughts on that?
Yeah. How we separate blame. I think, to some extent it is tricky, because I think the danger, of course, is to say, well, this was just my implicit bias. It's not my fault, and therefore I'm not responsible. That's not a good direction, because then that excuses any kind of behavior. And we need to make sure that people, particularly first responders, are treating others with respect, dignity, fairness, and kindness. I would argue even love is the goal. We want people to treat one another like real human beings. And so, this was really the central goal of my book, was to figure out, how do we address this inheritance? Like, what are approaches that have been shown to actually change people, change organizations, change cultures, so that they can live out their values? Because the idea of kind of unconscious bias is that many of us want to be fair. We believe that people should be treated fairly. We believe in equality, but yet, because of this inheritance, we can still behave in ways that actually don't align with our values.
Yes. And it feels as though when we force training on officers and we double down on it, it becomes ineffective anymore.
Yes.
And so part of me thinks we're framing this a little differently. Maybe even not as precise as we could. If I can just give you an example,
Yeah.
I really gravitated, my own bias, I suppose, gravitated to your relationship to these biases and culture. Because if we constantly focus on race, you have a department, some of these departments are a majority minority department.
Yes.
And especially on the West Coast, you have a lot of these up and down. So you have a much, much higher Hispanic culture, population. So you sit in a room where 7 out of 10 officers are Hispanic. One is white, one is black, one is Asian. Basically, one, if you were to map it out that way, and they're looking around saying, "I don't have any issue with this," right? So how can we? So this is what I want to say. So culture-wise, though, I do think, and I'll get a little bit of pushback on this, I do think policing has a culture problem because from the inside, looking inside the bubble, I have seen this behavior with people, even internally, because, oh, well, you work this busy division. We'll just say, the varsity division. Yeah, well, you only work varsity division during day watch hours. So you're out, I work varsity in the middle of the night. And all of a sudden, you're less than. You get this group, even with how we talk with civilians.
Yes.
We say things like, oh, well, I'm sworn. They're not sworn. So is it possible we can start talking about bias, but then lean heavy on the culture component?
Absolutely. You have brought up so many points. I don't even know where to start because there's so many good points. First of all, I just want to go back to something you said earlier about the mandatory trainings. This is, I think, a really important point. There is, and to be honest, I haven't figured out exactly how to square this circle myself, but there is research. We have to be honest about the research. There is research that shows that mandatory trainings can cause backlash. Mm-hmm. I haven't seen the research with regard to police departments in particular, but if you look at corporate settings, corporate environments, when you impose mandatory diversity training, it can cause the opposite reaction. People can double down. They can get more entrenched in their positions. So we have to be really thoughtful about making sure that trainings are actually doing what we want them to do. In terms of the culture piece, absolutely. That was something that came up so many times in my conversations with officers from, patrol, lieutenants. I spoke with sergeants. I spoke with chiefs. A theme that came up over and over was that the cultures weren't healthy for the cops either. There were, whether it was, retaliation or just sort of like toxic, language, abusive language, isolating officers who weren't, going along with the program. That culture is essential. And, one comment that stuck with me and that I still think about was a sergeant out in Oregon who said, after decades on the job, I started to see people as objects. You're a doper, you're an asshole, you're a crackhead, you're a jerk. And he said it grinds both ways.
Yeah.
It grinds both ways. And it started to grind me down inside as well. And so, yeah, I just, really affirm what you're saying about the culture as well.
So and I read that, and just for the listeners, I'm going to put links to Jessica's work because there's some good articles, and sometimes cops have to just bite down hard and just read because we don't like criticism, and oftentimes it feels like that criticism is only cutting one direction. It just feels like every time we do good things, the hundreds of thousands of good police interactions, but the few that ignite the fire tend to get all the oxygen. So these officers just get so frustrated because they feel like they're doing a good job, but they get lumped into everybody. They get lumped into the bad ones. But I know that with the advent of a younger officer coming in, they're a little bit more tech savvy. They're a little bit more well read because they've grown up with, the Library of Congress at their fingertips in their phone. Are you aware of the study out of the NYPD with Josh Carell that they talked about the impacts of implicit bias awareness training? Have you seen this?
I'm familiar with Carell's work in general.
Okay.
I don't know. Tell me what specific study you're referring to.
Sure. And this is a title. It's on NPR. NYPD study: implicit bias training changes minds, not necessarily behavior. So it's 188 pages. It's a big executive. It's almost like the 21st Century Task Force on policing and whatnot. So it's this big study. I'll copy it. I'll put it in the chat for us. But basically, what they said was officers went through it. It changed their minds. They did pre-training surveys, post-training surveys, and they said, "Well, I had no idea. I really need to think about these things." They took qualitative questions and said, maybe I got to think twice when I'm pointing my gun at a young man of color. Like maybe I really got to think about this. But then they looked at the data a year later, and what they found were enforcement actions involving Black people. So I'm reading from the study. Prior to the training, 56% of all stops involving Black people. 56% of all stops included Black people. After the training, 57%. And then they did the frisks, 58% before training, 60% after training. Summonses, arrests, and these numbers are statistically similar all the way through. So people will quote me on this and they'll say, well, what about the NYPD study? Or what about this and that? And it's hard for me to answer these questions because it just seems like there's so much data that says this is a well-intentioned endeavor, but it doesn't seem like we're moving the needle on it because it's so deep in the psyche.
Absolutely. Two things I want to respond to. Those results don't surprise me. Most trainings out there have not even been evaluated. So we don't know. They could be making things better. They could be making things worse. They could be leaving things exactly the same. Wow. And when they are evaluated, what's evaluated is often self-reported. Like, oh, I feel like I learned a lot. I have greater awareness. I'm more motivated. But I'm so glad that they actually looked at behavior here because that's what we care about. It's fine for everyone to feel good after a training, but that doesn't move the needle. So what I think, needs to happen is a much kind of deeper engagement. Things like, some of the approaches that I go dive deeply into in the book have to do more with trying to address some of the issues of chronic stress and officer well-being and create an environment in which an officer is better able to show up with respect, kindness, and dignity. Things like changing incentives, so you actually provide motivation for someone to behave differently rather than just hope that they will behave differently. I feel like incentives is a totally overlooked method to actually meaningfully shift people's behavior.
That's fantastic that you say that. Now you got me thinking. So Lois James is a professor out of Washington State, and I used some of her work during my dissertation stuff, and she has a whole lab. She is the understudy. Her mentor, Brian Villa, Villa, he has written a book called Tired Cops and the Problem with Tired Cops. He has a TED Talk, and yet this is the most under-addressed issue in policing. And I want to get your take on this. So Lois has this lab where she can test people's implicit bias and their reaction times. And when they sleep deprive officers and they have them do these, I guess you call them like in-person, whether it's VR or scenario-based training, officers are less able to control all forms of self-regulation, which includes their bias. Okay, so we know that she's shown that this is there. So this is a problem. Yet policing is the only profession where we have no worries about sleep minimums and sleep maximums. We do it with airlines, rail car, trucking, shipping. We now have it in the medical community, and we know the nefarious impacts of chronic sleep deprivation and behavior of all kinds. Nobody says, I only got 3 hours of sleep the last 3 nights. I'm in such a great mood and my patience level is high. So you discuss that and you talk about the incentives and you talk about the wellness portion. we only incentivize negative encounters. You're a
Yes.
good cop when you make an arrest. You're a
Yes.
good cop when everything is incentivized to have conflict.
Yes.
So when we talk about police reform, I think people like yourself and dare I say I'm part of your cadre here, we see the bigger problem. It's not just that there's vestiges and echoes of slave patrols. It's much bigger and broader, like at a neuroscience level. We're putting people in positions to fail and then acting surprised when they do.
Yeah, I mean, you have to imagine, racial bias is an issue in policing because it's an issue in this country. It's an issue in our country's history. And then you have officers who are, have some of the highest rates of illness and injury among professions. In a 2020 study found that a quarter of officers screened positive for depression, PTSD, suicidal ideation, and other mental distress. Cops are more likely to die by suicide than on the job. They're very, I'll use the word impaired. And I know that that's probably going to be offensive to some people listening, but I think we have to take seriously the kinds of stresses that people are under. And sleep deprivation is a huge one. I mean, one analysis of over 10,000 stops in Oakland found that when police were stressed and fatigued, they searched and handcuffed African-American individuals at higher rates. Another study of police recruits found that when they were more fatigued, they showed more bias performing in a simulation, and they mistakenly identified an unarmed Black suspect as armed. And so, you have the bias on one hand, and then you have these chronic stresses and impairments and fatigue that just exacerbate that bias. So absolutely, I think that's a really critical piece to look at in addition to changing structures like incentives.
Yes. Thank you for your support on this, because I feel like I'm beating the drum, and there are so many studies, there's book written, there's TED Talks on this subject that nobody wants to address. I'll share with you a story. When I was defending my dissertation, and it was chronic sleep deprivation and the decline in human performance, how it intersects with law enforcement, I experienced, high-level educators saying, I'm not going to excuse racist behavior because cops are tired. And, that's kind of an inarticulate, loose connection between the two. But the fact is, that's a true statement. There are going to be bad outcomes in general, and those outcomes are going to only increase in frequency when 40% of your personnel is sleep deprived. And you have to make quick decisions that take, your prefrontal cortex. And we're trying to minimize that amygdala response that you talk about so nicely. And how are we supposed to do that when the brain is just so groggy? So policy-wise, how about this, Jessica? We have cops who work in the middle of the night. And then for one day, they're going to work the day shift to talk about bias training. So I just want people to hear about this. We flip your schedule, which you're not used to, put you in a room talking about a very important topic. How much of that are you retaining? How do we?
And I think I certainly wouldn't. It's tricky because it's important to talk about all of these things as risk factors for kind of creating a perfect storm for bias, without necessarily saying, well, it wasn't, trying to use it as an excuse and saying, well, we can't really, I don't know, there's no like accountability or anything because this person was tired. I feel like there's sort of a tricky line to walk there, but I think that what we all want is hopefully what we want is the same thing. We want officers to be in peak emotional, physical, mental condition, which leads them to interact with people in a humane way. And whatever we can do to support that, I think we need to do. We need to take seriously. And one of the approaches, I hope I'm not jumping ahead, but one of the approaches that I found really compelling was dates back to some work by a Wisconsin lieutenant named Sherry Maples, who found herself becoming really callous and cynical over her career. She started noticing that she was showing up to situations with kind of this hardened demeanor. And in order to help herself, she went to a meditation retreat with Thich Nhat Hanh, this very famous and now unfortunately deceased meditation teacher, monk, scholar. And what was so interesting was after this retreat, she said she noticed people were being nicer to her. People were being kinder. And then she realized it wasn't other people, it was her. She was the one who had changed. She said she started noticing and seeing other people as a suffering human being who needed her help. And she even tells a story about a domestic situation that she handled completely differently after she went through this sort of training, this sort of immersion in mindfulness practice. It completely changed her outlook on how to interact with citizens.
So you've touched on something that is, I'm not sure if your research, you've uncovered this as well. We see what we're looking for. This is, you buy a new car and all of a sudden you see a bunch of Ford Mustangs or whatever it is. All of a sudden these are just everywhere. Like, oh, everyone must buy this car. Those cars are always there. You just didn't see them, but now you have a reason to see them. When you tell officers, go get me the bad guy, go find the bad guy, you're looking for the needle in the haystack, because we know, despite the numbers being, these are not good numbers. When you hear 500 homicides in Chicago and these things, these are bad. These are lost lives. Now, if I'm just being strictly clinical, you got a city of 3 million people and 500 lost their lives. It's very, very small, not to say insignificant for that family, but it is small from a data perspective.
Correct.
So we're looking for these needles. And so you don't see the mother pushing the stroller. At least you might see them visually, but your mind doesn't even absorb them.
I would extend that to say, even in the most violent communities, it's a tiny fraction of people in even those communities who are actually committing violent crimes.
It's 100. It is. Yes, it is the minority of all of our citizenry that is doing this. And, you try to explain this to cops, they'll say, millions and millions of interactions a year. We only shoot 1,000 times, or we take the life of somebody. These are rare events. And I tell them, on the other side of the coin is you're not being killed either at this incredibly high rate. We talked about suicide and COVID deaths. This is another number that has come in. COVID has taken many more cops. I go where the data leads me, whether I like to hear it or not. And that's where the data leads me. The data says this job is not as dangerous as you're being told it is. That's not to say it's not dangerous. You talked about this really nicely in one of your articles. And I forget what it was, but there's this idea of cops going to a training with Grossman.
Correct. Yes.
And how you have to be ready to take someone's life. Right. And I don't like telling cops this idea, and you'll hear me say this, when cops say all we want to do is go home at night, it makes it sound like every time you walk out the door, someone has a target on you. May be the case that you get into a shooting tonight. It may be the case that you get hurt, but you're also just as likely to fall asleep on the way home and crash. And no one's talking about that.
Yeah. So, and those,
please.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. I want to get your thoughts in real time. Go.
Absolutely. I think so much police training compounds fear by emphasizing everything that can go wrong in an encounter. Officers are taught to notice pre-attack indicators. Right. Anxiety, reduced mental processing, shifting eyes, not, staring into the distance. But one study that actually, I think a few studies have found that those pre-attack indicators are actually the same behaviors a person expresses when they're feeling threatened.
Yeah.
So,
absolutely.
Officers are going into an encounter looking for that pre-attack indicator, expecting something to go wrong, and maybe missing the fact that this person actually is terrified. That's why they're behaving this way. There are these warrior trainings that, teach officers they're in a hostile world. Like, Dave Grossman says, every single one of you is in the front line of a live ammo combat patrol every day of your life. Well, no wonder officers are terrified and, quick to respond and feel this heightened sense of fear. If that's what they're taught. Now, I think it's important to note, in all my research, I looked at all the public records I could find. Grossman has never served in combat.
Huh. Yeah. That's an interesting data point, right? It definitely bears some investigation. I've had the pleasure of speaking with Navy SEALs and war veterans, and these are very humble people. And some even within a police agency where we will have some colloquial, ideas of like, well, I'm a gunfighter. I work this division and this division. And some of these military personnel say, you're not a gunfighter just because you shot somebody. That's not a gunfighter. Somebody having to reload automatic weapons, going back and forth and drag their friends off who have been, blown up. That's fighting with guns. And so we self-aggrandize a little bit. And look, it's just, I have to be truthful. We self-aggrandize and we overestimate the danger. And then it creates this idea. Now, that's a bias, in my opinion. Like you're saying, one of your articles talked about Philando Castile.
Philando Castile, yes.
What was the name again? Tell me.
Philando Castile.
Philando, that's right. So, and this was a while back, and I remember seeing this and watching it and thinking, wow, this cop sure does appear to be in a heightened state. And you talk about what's happening at the brain and how the brain only has these decisions, and this person's going for their wallet, and this inordinate fear that came up. I believe bias training can help. It needs a seat at the table. But I also believe we need to be intellectually honest and stop saying you are in a war zone. Because now you're not policing citizens, you're policing possible combatants. And is that a way for the mind? Would you say it's setting the stage for this bias to just run amok?
Absolutely. I mean, going into a situation with this high level of fear is absolutely going to affect the behavior. I mean, the officer who killed Philando Castile had gone to one of Grossman's trainings. He had gone to a warrior training. And when you read the transcript of his response and you see the video, you see someone who seems to be completely decompensating. I mean, here, let me just
please
cut this out, but let me just find the particular, there's so much to say about this particular case. I'm trying to figure out how to.
No, of course.
So after that shooting, a former Minneapolis police sergeant watched the footage, and he said what he was seeing was an officer who became non-functional.
Yes.
There's the Cooper color code about different kind of levels of awareness.
Yes,
and
that's right.
What he, shared was that civilians generally operate in the green zone, where you're kind of aware of your surroundings, but not totally tuned in. Officers operate in the yellow zone, where they have a little bit of a heightened awareness, paying attention to the environment. When officers learn a firearm is present, they shift to the red zone, where they're in high alert. And in that situation, an officer should stand back, give clear instructions, and ask questions. And this particular officer who killed Castile skipped the red zone. He went to the black zone, where he was completely emotionally dysregulated. He did not give clear instructions. He did not ask questions. He did not stand back. He just went offline. And the result was a tragic, murder of a Montessori nutrition supervisor.
Right.
This gentle person who was carrying a gun legally because he lived in a high crime neighborhood. Right.
Yeah, it is a and when you see that, when you really break it apart and go piece by piece, and you're not I'm not surprised it happened. It's terrible. It did. Now, let me ask you this. On the other side of that is we're trying to have officers slow down. We're trying to have them not be the warrior mindset. And now I have people asking me, well, this is what you're going to get in Uvalde, Texas. You're going to get a bunch of people that are just going to stand around and not be the warrior that we need and not just rush into gunfire. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. Not necessarily Uvalde, but let's just say in general, when we're trying to slow down that warrior mentality, but those rare lightning strike events wherein you need an officer to go into a real gunfight.
Yeah.
How would you say we are to teach these officers to do both?
This was a question Sherry Maples, the officer I mentioned earlier, brought up, because in the sort of mindfulness meditation tradition, the goal is to do no harm, to be nonviolent. Yes. And she said, how do I reconcile that with the fact that I'm carrying a gun? And her teacher said, who else but someone acting mindfully would we want to carry a gun?
Yeah.
Of course, there are going to be situations where we need that warrior mentality, but those are rare. And we need someone to be, highly trained and able to match appropriate response to the appropriate situation. That Uvalde situation was a situation where we need a warrior response. But the case of this Montessori nutrition supervisor who had committed no crime and was just trying to get home from the grocery store was not a situation where we need that.
So then, if I'm going to borrow a line from Collins, good to great, maybe we need to also start thinking about getting the right people on the bus in the right seats and getting the wrong people off the bus. Mm-hmm. So I feel sometimes we're bringing just a wide swath of individuals into this profession and then hoping that this training that we give them, this 8 hours of implicit bias training and all this, just works well. We would never do that with an electrician or a plumber, certainly not a physicist, right? You get so much training that we have to, when we talk about systemic or institutionalized problems, that to me seems to be a big one. If we're going to call ourselves a profession, putting on a clip-on tie is not going to cut it. We need to expand this and truly educate, maybe mandate the college, mandate a certain age. Have you pondered that at all or looked into that?
That's interesting. Yeah, one of the sergeants who I spoke with, he was the same one who said, it grinds both ways. Mm-hmm. After 20 years, I got hardened and it grinds both ways. He said, if we bring more approaches into the profession, like mindfulness, like compassion, de-escalation, if we start to really build those into the culture, it might turn a lot of cops off. And he said, maybe that's okay. Maybe we actually do need to change the makeup, the kind of, the demographics, the kind of people who are drawn into the profession. He thought about it and he said, maybe that's okay. Change the whole culture.
Yeah. At a time when we're having a difficulty in hiring new officers, at a time when recruiting is bad, the profession's response seems to be lower the standards. You needed a 4-year degree? Not anymore. We don't need a 4-year degree. You needed to be 24 years old? 21 is fine. Whatever it is, we're lowering standards at a time when we need critical thinking people. I have a vision where the burden of police training falls onto the academic systems in America. You want to be an accountant, you go for 4 years and you become an accountant, and then you join Deloitte and Touche or whatever it is. You want to be an engineer, you do these things first, and then you go to your job. Why can't we create a real, honest to goodness, professional policing degree? Not criminal justice, but where you're going to learn about psychology. You're going to learn about small group communications. You'll learn about the history. Like actual, not a course for 8 hours, but a 12 or 14-week course where you can have discussions and get into these things. And after 4 years, you're going to walk out a well-rounded, educated, most likely more patient, better trained, better educated person to handle the complexities that this job throws at you.
It's an interesting perspective. I think I don't quite agree with you, actually.
Oh, great. That's fun to hear.
I'm not sure that just in general, my sort of attitude about higher education is I'm not sure that it is the best fit for everyone. There might be people out there who could be amazing cops and could have deep and meaningful relationships with the communities they serve and have that trust that is required, that actually increases clearance rates, and like allows for better policing. There might be a route to that doesn't go through, a 4-year degree. My perspective is partially shaped by the fact that I'm married to someone who didn't go to college, who's kind of a self-taught person, who's, very curious and reads a lot, but just wasn't a good fit for like the standard 4-year degree. And so that makes me think there might be, I'm just not sure. I haven't totally decided, but I do think that what's important is certainly the kind of knowledge, that people need to have. I think that history of policing is critical. And then there's the incentives piece. How do we actually want people to interact? And how do we incentivize the positive instead of only focusing on accountability and punishment?
Yes. Well, this is good. You're a highly educated individual that is not for that. So that's really good because I need to hear both sides. Whenever I say it, people say, oh, yeah, who doesn't like it? Cops without 4-year degrees think it's a terrible idea. Cops with 4-year degrees think it's a fabulous idea. So I have these cohorts.
I mean, advice is always autobiographical, right?
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, I would be really curious to talk to cops without 4-year degrees who feel that they have been able to integrate into the community, develop respectful, trusting connections, and what their methods for doing that have been.
So what about this idea that bias is going to cut both ways? So it's also these same cognitive phenomena that's happening for officers is also happening for a citizenry.
Yes.
And I show up to a radio call or I show up to the community and here I am, the middle-aged white guy with blonde hair and blue eyes. And I am immediately labeled as this or the root of all evil. This is what a lot of officers say. We do all the training. There is no responsibility. They want that dual responsibility of the citizenry as well.
Right.
What's your answer to that?
Well, part of it comes from, I spent a fair amount of time talking with Phil Tingarides, who you may know.
Sure. Yeah.
And one thing that I thought was so interesting about his approach was, I think he would agree, like you need both sides to come together, to come to the table. What Tingarides did was he actually went toward the criticism. You were talking earlier about how cops don't like to be criticized, but
right.
I think for the community, it's essential to feel heard and to feel that they're, to know that the police hear their anger, their deserved anger over past mistreatment. And what Tingarides did was, go to meeting after meeting, participate in the Watts Gang task force, hear the community's complaints, absorb them. He said it wasn't easy. It's horrible to hear over and over, how much suffering the community is experiencing. But it was through that connection and through him actually being able to listen without firing back in defensiveness that started to build that trust. And it's that trust and those relationships that over time start to break down the stereotypes. Officers in, one of the chapters, I talk about the community safety partnership in LA, and the officers there said, before this approach, they would stereotype everyone in a community as a victim or a perpetrator. So they had that very, dualistic kind of thinking, and the community would stereotype the cops just the same. But after they started developing relationships, the cops started seeing the community members as like much more diverse and multifaceted. And the community started to see the officers as not just one thing either. Yeah.
So, and it's interesting too, because Phil was the hard charging cop for a lot of his career, but he did have a very significant change of perspective. So I give him and Ahmad a ton of credit. That program is still in there. Here are some of the issues that arise when you have a select group of officers that get the opportunity to now do this. But in that same area, You have officers that still have to respond to crime, still have to say your party's too loud. And then what ends up happening is you get the cool cops that get to walk the kids to school, that get to see everybody. And then you got like the mean step parent who comes in. They're wearing the same uniform, but they're the ones saying, no, I believe we have to rotate this all around. You can't just let one group of people, because you talk about the 5-year idea. It's like a 5-year commitment. But on the other side of that, people look at it as it's a 5-year limit, because you'd want to stay there forever if you could. That would be a spot you'd want to go and be like, I like this. I'm not getting shot at. I get to engage. It's a good time. Sure, every now and again, some enforcement, but it's not the grind. And so it becomes a 5-year tour limit so that other people can get in, but then people get extended. And so what is your
But isn't
your
that
idea?
interesting? I just think that's so interesting that when officers have the choice, they would rather have these meaningful relationships. They would rather have this more, I don't know what the humane, for lack of a better word, kind of everyday experience where they're integrated into the community. I mean, one officer, Jeff Joyce, said, I'd never go back to the old way of policing. Why?
Right.
When this is so much more meaningful and life-giving and life-affirming.
Well, and this is the cognitive distance. You get the 22-year-old who comes in and says, I want to chase bad guys. It's very difficult to get them into a CSP type program or a senior lead officer program. But you get a cop that's been around for 8 or 12 years. They've been on the grind. They've had a few dings and dents. They see the difference now. Yes. And they recognize not everybody in this community is bad. In fact, most are not. But there's a really interesting study. It'd be neat if we can pull this off. Ask the 2-year cop or the 1-year cop or the cop who does probation in the busy area. What percentage of your population are like criminals? I've done this with young cops. They will say 75%.
Oh my
right.
gosh.
So then you write the number on the board, 225,000. These are the number of people who live in this area. And you think 75%, right? So you write up 185,000. You think there's that many people run around, and you and your 7 officers are keeping them in order. And eventually we whittle it down to, and then they realize, oh my gosh, like it's like 0.3% of people. That's going to give you the 1,000 number or even the 100. Because even when you say 3,000, they're like, I don't know if it's, because we know what a 3,000 person protest looks like. You could shut down a city with 3,000 people. So certainly if you have a 6-mile square area and 3,000 were just committing crime, we would be on a tactical alert. But you have to teach them that. And I think, like you say, where the institution of policing doesn't allow that growth. You have to be the lucky one to apply to these jobs and then get brought in. And someone like me, who I would love to do something like that, I've applied for these spots multiple times, but there's a demographic barrier that doesn't lend itself. And so even when I say, look, I grew up in poverty, I had a single mom, I can relate to people on a human level. Even though I might not look like them, I can relate. And you get denied. It becomes disheartening in many ways.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious. Thank you for sharing that perspective. I really appreciate it. I know that last I checked, I think last I spoke with Amada, the program is kind of slowly expanding. Does that mean that there are going to be more slots for more people over time?
It is. It's expanding. It's expanding exponentially. It started in this little area. Now it's going into the valley and everything. But when you speak with her, bring my name up and say, oh, has he tried? She knows me by name. Like I sat across trying to get into these areas because I think I think I would excel in something like this just because of my energy, my education background. It would be just such a neat way to navigate policing, and then to have the podcast with it, and I just feel that I could bring kids on and we could talk about things, and I can't break in. So these are, and this is the problem too. When you have a big machine, it's like a Google or it's like an Amazon. You're just part of a machine that's running, and that's where I think policing has become almost business-like because you have to run it that way.
It seems like, at least when some of the research that I looked at about CSP suggests that it's an approach that is extremely effective in meeting the goals that it set out to meet. So an independent analysis found that it did decrease violent crime, and it also decreased arrests. And when I spoke with the researcher who had studied it, she said, a lot of folks can't really get their head around the fact that you can decrease violent crime and decrease arrests at the same time.
Yeah.
And the other thing that happened was it changed the way officers and community members saw each other. So like I was saying before, the officers would see everybody as either a victim or a perpetrator. And after, because they'd formed these meaningful relationships, because they were incentivized to do so, instead of incentivized to just make arrests, they started seeing, oh, this community that I used to see as a monolith is actually made up of parents and elders and community leaders and partners and resources, people who bring resources and everybody else. And so it kind of created this kaleidoscope view of a community that before officers had seen as just, one of two things.
So I've heard you mention this a few times, and I think that is to its point, the importance of it, the idea of incentivizing.
Yes.
And would you say that is a Rosetta Stone to helping to solve the bias issues? Is the incentive, what would you call it? The incentive mechanisms?
Yes.
That are in place?
I think it's completely overlooked. I mean, when people talk about changing fundamentals about police, how police operate, what I hear is people talking primarily and sometimes exclusively about accountability and making sure that bad behavior is punished properly. Of course, that is essential. We can't have people out there, committing crimes, behaving with impunity, behaving illegally. That is essential. But my belief is if you only focus on accountability, if you only focus on punishment, all you're doing is making a floor below which behavior can't get. You're just limiting how bad the behavior can get. If what I'm interested in is the ceiling, I think accountability is about making a floor, but actually incentivizing is about making a better ceiling. We want, and actually encouraging the behavior that we want people to have. What if officers were rewarded for things like forming trusting relationships with the community that they're protecting, so that when a crime is committed, someone will talk,
Yeah.
What if they're rewarded for de-escalation? What if they're rewarded for defusing a situation, and that's actually elevated as something that they get promoted for, that they get accolades for, that they get elevated for? I think that we need to look at the behavior we want and then build in incentives so people are actually, there's some teeth behind those requests.
Yeah. No, this is good. You're really good at making the analogy. I'm going to tell you, because the idea of like the floor and the ceiling is brilliant. And okay. So if you had, the magic wand and you're coming into agencies, would you start with, let's look at what you're incentivizing. I also say, let's look at what you're measuring. Because what gets measured across any spectrum is what we're going to focus on. So if all we're measuring is a reduction in crime, well, by hell or high water, we're going to bring that number down. And I think it's there's Engel and some of the others that talk about how if you bring down crime, but your community hates you, this isn't like an effective metric anymore.
Culture is what you reward and what you punish.
Mm-hmm.
Culture is what you reward and what you punish. So if you're going into a culture to try to improve it, understand it, work with it, you have to look at not only what you're punishing, but what you're rewarding. Because if you're saying out of one side, we want officers to behave respectfully, but you're rewarding hook 'em and book 'em, you're rewarding disrespectful language, you're rewarding dehumanizing behavior, then you're not, then that culture piece is going to reflect that. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it was Peter Drucker that said organizational culture eats strategy for lunch. Like you can do all the interventions. I could put everyone in all kinds of training, but at the end of the day, when those two officers are looking to get promoted or looking to make a gang unit or looking to make a tactical unit, they're going to say, are they a good cop? And very rarely will somebody sit in an interview for these specialized units and say, I have a great relationship with my community. And I really embrace a territorial imperative mindset. They say, I am serving, protecting, I'm getting guns off the street, and I'm putting people in jail. And that just rings true to everybody. Is there maybe, what do you think of this? What do you think about shifting like a term limit also for policing? Like, look, you've been here too long. Maybe just in general, we have people across all spectrums of policing, the chiefs and the assistant chiefs, they've been around for 35, 40 years. So maybe that incentive, when you don't know what to do, you just do more of what you know sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that thinking permeates down, and everyone says, "Oh yeah, this is all BS. Go out there and get a bad guy." Like, how do you change that culture when it's at all levels?
I mean, this is the $64,000 question.
Sure, right.
I think, if you're talking about someone like Phil Tingarides, who really went through a mindset shift, I think that shows that people can change. And in fact,
True.
it might be the people who have seen over time the cumulative impact of the old way of doing things, who are maybe open to doing things in a different way. Like when I'm thinking about, the officers who I spoke with, it was some of the old timers who were like, this wasn't working for anybody. It's not working for me. It's not working for the community. It's just not working. So I think that those, more long-term members of the community could be really helpful in trying to change the culture. But how you change an entire culture, I mean, one of the things that I've been persuaded of through research and through talking to a lot of experts and scholars about this is that we are very persuaded by social norms. So if we see the people around us doing something, we're going to be more likely to do it. And particularly if people who are popular and well-liked are doing those things, we're going to be more likely to do it. So I think what has to happen is we have to find popular, well-liked members of organizations who are open to a new way of doing things. And then it starts to spread throughout the culture.
It's interesting. At the end of the day, like, we're still, as a species, drawn to that. Like, you can't get away from it. Sometimes it's like the popular kid in class has to do it, so others will follow.
Yeah. I mean, the whole, social media influencer world is based on this idea. We see someone popular do something and then we want to do it, or we want to buy it, or we want to, copy what they're doing.
So I want to be cognizant of your time, and I'm going to wrap up, and I would just like to ask a few things to maybe leave some of the officers and citizens that are listening. What can they do now? Like, what's an action item? So an officer that's getting ready for patrol, listening to this on the way in, what can you tell them? Like, try this, like, just start your day like this, or just have this conversation. What would your advice be to start moving the needle?
I think for an officer there's the individual change, and then there's the structural or organizational change. For the individual level, I would say be open to and investigate mindfulness meditation. If you haven't already, there are a ton of free resources out there. The officers who I spoke with who really started to develop that practice said it was life-changing for them, and it helped them change the way they saw the people they served. So there's mindfulness meditation, there's something called metta or compassion meditation. All of these are really effective approaches that help manage chronic stress, and they also help stop the kind of automatic response that can lead to biased behavior. So that's on the individual level. I mean, at an organizational level, if there are leaders listening to this who have some power to make some structural changes, I would really look seriously at what the culture is rewarding and start thinking about what is the behavior that we actually want that's going to promote respect and that's going to cause the community to trust and actually talk to officers and feel like partners in safety rather than adversaries. And then what are some things we can do in our organization to make real incentives so people are actually getting what they, promotions, rewards, accolades for those behaviors?
Well, just it sounds like your work has just begun with the writing of the book. So that old saying, if God puts you on earth to do a number of tasks, you're going to be so busy that you're never going to die. So good for you for that. I do want to be respectful of the time. I want to thank you so much. I'm hoping we can have you back on, and maybe I can talk to you offline to see where I can, maybe update my training a little bit so I could deliver this in a palatable way. For everyone listening, the End to Bias, a Beginning. It's a great read. I'll put all kind of links in the show notes. And Jessica, thank you so much for being here and talking with us.
Thanks so much for the really lively conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next time.